Not on my watch.
That's right. Not today, Satan. Well, everybody, hello. This should just be a running start. I would keep most of
2
this.
minutes in.
Why the heck not? Yeah, Tim Stafford has some repenting to do. And yeah, so why don't we lead with that today?
Just across the board. Is this going to turn into confession time?
I mean,
forgive me, Father Mike.
Yep.
Got called out, justly so. The poem from last week, the first line was from James Baldwin. The rest of the poem was from a poet named Nikita Gill. James Baldwin had a bunch of other things on the same topic, which I ended up reading some articles that he wrote in the early 80s that were really good. But so I thought what I would do is I would read a poem from Nikita Gill, the poet.
Well, evidently you already did.
True.
Last
but
episode.
This time we'll do it with full credit to her.
Here's what I love.
This is what's that?
Here's what I love. I love that there is at least one person in the VOXOLOGY community that is like, I don't know. I mean, I know Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein in terms of poets. And then I know one Robert Frost poem about the two roads.
It's a good poem.
That's all I got. You, the deep well of not only cultural, like pop cultural references, but like poetic references. There is one other person that can match your energy. And that just makes me happy. And they wrote in to say, nope, not at all. So go ahead. Give us this one from Nikita what?
Gill. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. Gill. Nikita Gill. She is an Irish Indian poet.
Ooh.
And this is a poem called You Have Become a Forest. She says, one day when you wake up, you will find that you have become a forest. You have grown roots and found strength in them that no one thought you had. You had become stronger and more beautiful, full of life-giving qualities. You have learned to take all the negativity around you and turn it into oxygen for easy breathing. A host of wild creatures live inside you and you call them stories. A variety of beautiful birds rest inside your mind and you call them memories. You have become an incredible self-sustaining thing of epic proportions. And you should be proud. You should be so proud of yourself of how far you have come from the seeds of who you used to be.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. She obviously doesn't know us, but I like that in the abstract.
Yeah.
You've got some chaos in you, Stafford.
A little bit.
I know that much. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Nikita Gill. And I'm sure Tim is mispronouncing that, so please write in and correct him. English professor. On the semi-good news front, we had Pastor Ara on, a friend of a friend of a friend who last summer recorded two. He oversees and pastors an Iranian congregation in West LA, and took a video of two of his congregants being arrested by ICE. And we had him on, told the story. They were here seeking asylum. I mean, all the things, just like they're Christians, every box you would check about an unjust detention, they checked those boxes. And I've sort of kept tabs a little bit on the story, just wondering how this is going to end. And Christianity Today this week had a short article. After 9 months in immigration detention, Iranian Christian convert Reza was freed this week, his pastor Ara Torosian reported. Reza's church kept track of his exact time in detention, 267 days, just to meet a quota.
Yeah.
Border Patrol agents detained Reza and his wife, Marjan, who are Christians and asylum seekers from Iran, on a Los Angeles sidewalk near their home in June of last year. Reza was in detention ever since in New Mexico. Marjan was released after 120 days in detention, was granted asylum, but two different judges were handling the couple's cases. Reza and Marjan's advocate said the couple had followed legal procedures for asylum seekers.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to 2025, it was unusual for asylum seekers to be detained while their cases were pending. I wonder what changed in 2025. The article goes on to say the release comes as the U.S. has all but ended admission for international refugees other than white South Africans. So awesome. Just so great. And then it wouldn't be a Voxology podcast without some sort of blasphemy from our Secretary of War. Closing one of his press conferences with, may Almighty God continue to bless our troops in this fight. To the American people, please pray for them every day on bended knee, with your family, in your schools, in your churches, in the name of Jesus Christ. To the troops, keep going and Godspeed. And hallelujah, I would love to pray for the safety of our troops, but this thing keeps getting drenched in the language that somehow God is protecting us in this war. And I just want to vomit, multiple times every time I hear him speak. God bless him. Jesus died for him. So
I think that I was thinking about yesterday, talking to my students, something about. So yesterday I read this short story. I read like 3 short stories throughout the semester, like kindergarten. Like they just kind of sit there and I read out loud to them, just to break up the
in class
reading article. Yeah. So yesterday I did that with the.
You're the best college professor in the history of college professors. Yes.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. I think I actually have the plaque on the wall for it.
Yes.
I read a John Steinbeck story yesterday called Breakfast that we read and I actually read it when I was doing every Easter down at VOXOC, and I was trying to find a different like avenue into the Easter story every year, to try to just find a different angle or something different to focus on or talk about. Last year I did this. I read this short story to them and just kind of picked it apart, but it's so like this, all of his stories take place during like, Great Depression era or kind of, Dust Bowl, different thing, Grapes of Wrath, all that kind of stuff. Most of the stuff is kind of in that area and it's on the West Coast. And this one, it's really weird. And it's just this guy walking in the morning in the valley and he comes across a tent of migrant farmers and they feed him breakfast and then they go off to work and he leaves. It's real short. And that's like the whole narrative plot. Like there's no big tension or anything like that. But it starts and ends with this idea of like this memory brings back, and this is kind of why I liked the poem that I read today, because he's just like, there's some magic in this memory that I can't quite put my finger on, but every time I think about it, it fills me with this warm pleasure. And so I just sit there with the students and I'm like, what is it about this story? Like, what evidence can you find to show me what it is about this that the author can't put his finger on? Because there's the obvious thing with the breakfast, but we just get in this long conversation about hospitality and dignifying the humanity in other people. And even during times of like the Great Depression or, just really, really where it just seems like the whole world is ending kind of time periods. Like there's always these folks that are leaning into the hope within that time period. And they can sometimes be like kind of like a buoyant life raft that helps pull other folks up in those time periods. And so I like talking about the war that's going on right now and how the deficit has already doubled. And he said he's going to get rid of the deficit. Now we're at like 39 trillion or something like that. And we're burning through like 200 billion a day or some crazy number for the war. We were reading an article about student loan forgiveness. And it's like you're watching all those things, all those conversations go completely off the table because of how much in debt we're going to be after this. Like these conversations about healthcare and infrastructure and education. I'm like really nervous as my kids are going to be approaching college at the point in which he's moving out of this office. We're going to be in a really rough spot. So I perseverate on that stuff all day. So thinking about like this Steinbeck poem or the Steinbeck short story or this Nikita Gill poem, and what does it mean to be people who in the midst of the complete darkness, right? It's a cliche that we will talk about, like being the little light in the complete darkness and nothing drives out darkness but the light and blah, blah, blah. But what does that actually mean to be those people that are not just saying thoughts and prayers or not just saying like hopeful words, but actually helping to, what does it mean to manifest that hope in yourself and understand it and really believe it and then extend both your hands out to try to lift up other folks?
What does it mean?
It's just, I don't know, but it's
What's it
so
do?
dark right
You ask
now.
that question literally every week. Some
I
form
know,
of
but
that
it
question
just keeps coming
every
up.
single week.
I
Well,
think it's
you
our
answer
job,
it.
right? I don't know what the answer is, but I look at the thing with the Steinbeck story, and it's like the migrant farmers that are sharing their meals with this guy. We don't know his name. We don't know anything about the guy. They're literally the people that have nothing, right? So they were super stoked because they'd had 12 days of work versus maybe months of no work, or finding a farm that only gives you 1 day of work. They were really happy and felt blessed and were really hopeful because they had 12 days of work, which enabled them to get some new work clothes and whatnot. And they're eating bacon and bread and coffee. And the story just talks about how it's like, God Almighty, this is just the best food ever and whatever. And everyone's so full of hope, but their hope is in like the community of people that they're, which one of which is a complete stranger. There's something in that, like even in the darkest times, extending hospitality and extending whatever, like lifts everybody up somehow.
Yeah.
But then I was like, hey, America used to be a country like this. Like every old book or movie you watch, like someone puts a pie on a windowsill and anyone that's walking by can stop in and have a piece of pie. Or if you're a cowboy going through town, there's always a barn and some leftover food for you to have at a stranger's home. We did have a pretty strong thread of hospitality, but as we've gotten, I don't know if it's because of population or cynicism or whatever, we are not as hospitable as we used to be. So there's something powerful in that idea of hospitality, the woman at the well, like giving the last thing that you have no matter what, because you believe in something that's a little bit bigger than your woes or whatever. So I'm trying to think about that in light of everything that's happening, because there's just so much darkness and negativity. And yes, I have chaos in me and darkness in me, and it's easy for me to dip into that because it's a pool that's just ready to be dipped into. But like having this actual hope that I believe is a real tangible thing, and then extending that out in ways in which people experience it too, I think is important. Like learning how to deliver hope to someone who doesn't speak metaphorically the same language as you is a different task, whether that's a political language or, an ideological language or an actual language. But, someone spending 9 months in the detention thing, that's a lot. That's a lot to, that's a lot for them, obviously, physically, emotionally, spiritually, everything. But for his community and the folks around, that couple and whatnot, and then all of the other ones are still locked away right now as well. It's like, it's just a lot there's an existential depression hanging on us right now as we try to, like, just watching the news this morning, you just are watching our country do things that almost a majority of the country doesn't agree with, but it's happening anyway. And it's like, you feel very powerless in that, where it's just like, well, yeah, like everyone says no, but you're doing it anyway, and you're building a debt that's going to affect our children. And so I'm trying to figure out, I don't know what the answer is, but I do bring it up every week because I want to know. I think this is one of the key truths of a faith that we claim to be real. And if that's the case, then I think this is quote unquote our calling, is to be the people of hope and light. But that's going to change in varied situations, what that looks like.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. Tim Stafford.
But I do like
riffing.
Poetry.
Yeah, you do. Speaking of poetry.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the kingdoms of the world for a second. I got to get through this. We have to move on to the second part of we just have to. It's March.
Yeah.
So all of that is yes. But I think you're tapping into something that, at least for my inherited theological tradition, was greatly misunderstood. And that's the idea of spiritual warfare. So if we've been talking about powers and principalities and a kingdom, a counterfeit kingdom that exists already, and that the earth isn't neutral territory, but cosmically contested space. And I don't remember, was it last episode? We were going through implications of, okay, well, I mean, this obviously has pretty significant implications on the Christian life if all of this is true. And there were a couple we didn't get to. One of them is the idea of spiritual warfare. And for me, I think we've talked about this. Spiritual warfare was a very individualistic pursuit. Anytime I was taking steps to growth, those were opposed by this enemy. And spiritual warfare was, presented in a way that was either truth and lies, where yes, you're believing lies, and so you need to repeat the truth. Or like in John Eldridge's words, I'd made agreements with the enemy about my worth, value, identity, significance, and I had to break those in the name of Jesus. That was one version of spiritual warfare. There was another version of spiritual warfare that was more intercessory, and it was more like invite Jesus into these places that were really dark, and using your imagination to sort of reframe those and how Jesus might respond, and those sorts of things. And then there was another version that was like very, very power encountery. It was like you had certain words you had to use, and you would try to like speak to and gain power over the spirit that was oppressing the person or the physical space or whatever. And I have some like very tangible memories of things that I cannot explain. And I don't know that I understood them rightly or still do. I just don't have a category for them. There would be times, I have stories. And and I don't know, are those psychosomatic? Are those, like we're just enculturated, and so we behave into these patterns that we've kind of been taught are out there? Or is there something really going on? I don't know. But if the powers and principalities, the way that we're construing them is right, then I'm all for truth, and I'm all for reimagining sad and horrible scenarios with Jesus coming in and blessing and rescuing. And I'm all for the idea that the enemy can actually oppress people and that Jesus provides liberation. But I wonder if we, in some strange way, like dramatically overestimate the influence of the powers on an individual level and underestimate the influence of the powers on a conceptual ideology community level, if that makes sense. There are unclean spirits in the Gospels that Jesus confronts. I have no doubt that those things are real if I'm going to accept the worldview of Jesus. And those seem to be different than the powers and the principalities. But Paul doesn't spend a lot of time on individual unclean spirits. He spends all of his time on these powers and principalities and warning his churches against them. And so point number one, in terms of reframing spiritual warfare, is I wonder if we don't overdo it individually, but we underdo it communally. And so it's the same way that Christian discipleship is often marketed. It's all about what my growing in Jesus, and the community exists to help my individual relationship with Jesus. Whereas in the New Testament reckoning, my individual relationship with Jesus exists to bless the community and to gift the community and to receive from the community. And so I think that the spiritual warfare thing can become a subject of really wild speculation and almost a dopamine rush when it comes to power encounters and like all of the things. And I'm not trying to diminish that there maybe are some things that are real in there, but I don't know how much permission the Bible gives us to walk into those realms with some of the trappings around, trying to liberate people. I just don't. Paul doesn't really encourage us to confront these powers. Even Jude talks about teachers who are engaging celestial beings to their own harm. And so I don't I think there is room for the unclean spirit thing. And there's a guy named Clint Arnold that talks about how people can be demonized. But I do think the thrust of the New Testament is more on the communal sort of dynamics, and that in a fallen world we simply do have diseases and inconveniences and frustrations and injustices, and those don't always have to be tied to powers and principalities. Because Paul wasn't really thinking on an individual level when he was writing the bulk of the New Testament. So as we've been saying, does that make sense so far? I think we radically overestimate their influence individually and underestimate their influence collectively. And just as a
how
reminder,
much of it is influence too, like, because that picture that we grew up with was like this inhabitant, like, and you have some of that, like with the Legion or whatever. Like there are things that it seems that Jesus drives out of a person.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it's more, how much more of it is influential. Like,
yeah.
Because we made a side comment or a joke last episode about the Secretary of War doing something that seemed demonic.
Yeah.
And
Antichrist. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's like the old,
but I think, the old paradigm is I'm inhabited by, maybe another way of looking at that is that there are times when I'm walking, and we'll get to this actually at the end of our episode, hopefully. Although who knows the questions you're going to be asking along the way. So I can never predict. No, don't you dare zip it. Don't you dare zip it. That the alternative paradigm maybe is something like the powers are powering and principalating, and I'm hooking into them whenever I'm acting in ways that are not congruent with the kingdom. And so I'm actually giving them power over myself and the collections. Like a dumb example would be, not a dumb example, not at all, but like take pornography, which is just the classic, hey, this isn't hurting anybody. It's accessible. I'm trying to manage desires, and I'm dealing with marriages, spouses, or unavailability for any reason, and all the things. It's this perfect picture of something that I think we can easily begin to justify. And as you study what is actually happening in the adult entertainment industries and around some of these hub sites that are out there, you realize the blanket of pollution, corruption, abuse, objectification, all the things that we would know is already happening. And my individual choice to partake or not partake is a choice to either strengthen those nodes of power that exist in culture and allow them access to me, or to resist them and practice something else. And like I had early in my Christian life, a buddy of mine handed me, it was called A Prayer for Sexual Healing. And it was a pre-written prayer that talked about powers and principalities and all the things. And it was less about whatever, exercising whatever is in me, and more about like, God, I want to detach myself from that whole way of living. Does that make sense? Like the difference, it was something that was less internal to me and something that I was plugging into that was already happening and already in the world.
There's a weird thing too, though, with like, that's a good example, because some of the things that also drive you into that are like dopamine and like actual, these real physical things, like desire becoming overwhelming or whatever it is. Like there's these different things that are, so then it becomes really interesting, because it's not just ideological, it's physical too. So the ideological choice to choose against it isn't always enough. I guess it's more just like, it's like a three-dimensional thing.
Here we go.
We're always
three-dimensional
solutionals.
Yes,
but it is. You know what I mean? Like when you're driven, when when your system is literally overloaded by a dopamine addiction or whatever, you're not making clear ideological choices. So
I'm not saying this is a disembodied ethereal issue.
No, but I think that's how it's always been presented, as like so what I'm asking, I guess, is like, if these powers are largely, or maybe it's not just one lane of traffic, maybe there is a possessive force, but there's also just an influential force that can influence societies as a whole to, you know what I mean? And then,
yeah.
But when your human physiology takes over it and participates in that, it becomes a larger or a different thing to approach.
I don't know that Paul would say it's a different thing, because flesh is one of the powers. And so
that's interesting.
So we're energizing flesh with this sort of apocalyptic power alliance of sin, death, and flesh that exists out there that is corrupting everything. So I'm using this not to make that point, but just to say, because I was just always told, well, listen, of course it's wrong. Just, stop. Don't do it, whatever. And it's like dieting. It's like, yes, I know I should eat better. I know this. I know this. And to your point, knowing isn't always the issue. But the battle was framed as an individual battle against me and Satan. Yeah. And I'm trying to frame it as like, this is an expression of the powers. And I don't want to feed into the powers. Like my individual and collective role is to resist the powers and provide the alternative. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is this is less about an individualistic battle and more about a collective battle. No, yes. If somebody were writing in saying, hey man, how do we battle this? Well, then we're talking 3D, right? It's a physical, emotional, spiritual, like a whole body sort of issue. But in this like narrow sector, I was just trying to illustrate the difference between me warring against my own temptation, making it an individual thing, and saying, oh my goodness, no, this is like, and that actually helped me. And this prayer that this fellow gave me actually helped immensely. And I was so surprised, because it was this pre-written, I consecrate this in the name of Jesus, and I repent of this, and you just sort of recited it over different areas of your life. And I was very surprised at the power that thing had. So I don't know how it all works on individual levels. The big point I think we've been trying to make is that it's not just the individual level that is at issue. And that the far more persuasive and pervasive elements about spiritual warfare don't operate at necessarily an individual level. They are more in the collection, the collective, modality.
Well, with the porn as that example, like shame isolates you so much. And when that conversation is only compounded by shame and pointing fingers and guilt or whatever,
right,
and it pushes somebody into, so it literally does the opposite. I mean, it pushes you into a solitary battle.
That's right.
Whereas being in a communal thing allows you to share that burden or take some of the shame off of it to be able to navigate out of it or whatever.
Yes. And that is why the whole idea of confession. So like, see, this is what you do to me, Stafford. And I need people to write in and say that it's good, because I have so much to get through. And then you just ask such wonderful questions that raise all these other topics. So in the old way, confession or accountability groups were the groups, that I grew up most familiar with. And the goal of those was to manage your sin, to sin less.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly like a legit, a legitimate goal, but it's just the smallest of all the goals that are out there. You know what I mean? It's like, no, I want to become the kind of person who just doesn't want to do this and chooses and lives a whole relational, spiritual, emotional kind of life where this isn't as attractive to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so accountability groups could often just add shame, and you would hide, and it would just add to the hiding. My therapist said something that was so brilliant once. He said, the opposite of shame is connection. And so confession done rightly is that is healing. When the scripture talks about confess your sins to one another, pray for one another that you might be healed. That's why 12-step groups are so amazing, and different from church accountability groups, right? Because and I mean, very often they're different. And the best small group experience I ever had was in a group therapy session with a bunch of degenerates. It was like, oh my goodness, this is the most transformative thing I've ever been a part of. And it was not explicitly Christian at all, but it was incredibly transformative. So point there, Timothy, is, C.S. Lewis has this great line that sexuality is meant to bring us into community with another person in the most intimate sense. And pornography usurps that and brings us into shame and disconnection and alienation and all the things. And I thought that was really interesting, because so much of discipleship has just been construed as an individual warring against the individual temptations, as opposed to a community of people learning to resist the dynamics, the power and principalities that are corrupting human life, of which confession and connection is a part, right? That's one of the ways you engage in spiritual warfare, is you take what is done in darkness and you bring it into light. And if that light is real light and not fake light, it's not guilt light or shame light or some earthly accountability light, but it's actual grace, man, there is healing there. You know what I mean? And so for me, spiritual warfare just got exploded into this massively huge concept. And that's what I'm trying to capture in all of this, is that you take 1 Corinthians is an example. If you just want to read how Paul understands spiritual warfare, Paul writes to a church and sees that in the actions of this church, there are community patterns of behavior, postures that people adopt towards each other, that are characterized by mistreatment, exploitation, oppression, satisfying sensual desires at the expense of others, the fueling of greed, pride, ambition, ego. He sees all of this communal behavior, and it manifests itself in the church splitting, around factions. It manifests itself around the poor being shamed at the Lord's Supper by the rich. It manifests itself in an emphasis of this charismatic spiritual gifts. Behind all of this, he's seeing the powers and the principalities that operate according to some sort of perverted wisdom that just seems normal in our age. It's the wisdom of prestige and power and pleasure fulfillment and domination of others. It's all of that. That's how cosmic enslavement shows up. And so the point of church is to build communal dynamics that resist all of that, right? So when you get to things like, there's so much to say. When you get to things like, why should the church meet? Why can't you just watch a service and consume a podcast? What's the point in the physical communal gathering? Well, it's because the primary commands that Paul gives in the New Testament are all framed around one another's, right? 59, 57 one another commands that all assume the continued sinfulness of each other, and that your individual salvation gets worked out in the middle of this. And so if Paul's construal of powers and principalities is right, it totally reframes spiritual warfare away from the individual and more towards the collective. But it also then reframes the purpose of the church, because in Ephesians, Paul will call the church the new humanity, an actual monument to the powers. in the sense that the new humanity, where people have nothing in common other than just they've accepted the grace of Christ in their lives, realized they've needed it. They've been leveled by the gospel so that those who think they're important in the world are brought low, and those that are disenfranchised in the world are lifted up so that we share a meal as siblings. Like, that is what spiritual warfare turns out to be. And the only place to do that is the church. Now, that doesn't mean the building, but that means the community. And the reason the church exists is that we might not only be the monument to the triumph, but we might be the people who implement the triumph of God early. Because God is king, but not everyone acknowledges that. And so we're the community that lives under the kingship of God, but we have to practice living into that kingship. And so all of the weirdness of church, the demand for reconciliation, the petty annoyances we have with each other, the desires to faction around personalities and favorite teachers and whatever, like all of that has to be resisted in the church. The presentation of and the cultivation of the imago Dei, so that per Paul's instructions, you're seeing women as sisters to be treated with absolute purity, as opposed to women to be objectified or ad nauseum. Is this making sense? So yeah, to me,
right there.
Whatever I've got, I'm trying to keep up with you, bro. So there's this guy named Paul Dazat, D-A-Z-A-T. He has a Substack, which I didn't know was a thing, but they're all over now. I think they're blogs that you pay for. I think they're just blogs that you pay for. I think that's what it is. But he writes this, and I thought, ooh, Tim, let me see. You bring some poetry. I'm going to bring a Substack.
Deal.
He says, I think we've gotten spiritual warfare wrong. Not because evil isn't real, and not because the New Testament doesn't speak about powers and principalities, but because somewhere along the way, the battle stopped looking like Jesus. Spiritual warfare became loud, it became theatrical, it became something you perform rather than something you live. I love that. I've been in rooms where we shouted at the ceiling before church services, binding spirits over the sound system. I've seen people march around buildings like Jericho. I've done that. I've heard prayers pleading the blood of Jesus over Wi-Fi signals so demons wouldn't corrupt the live stream. I'm not saying any of that with sarcasm. I've participated in some of it. I was sincere, most of us were, but looking back, I've wondered if we were fighting the wrong battles in the wrong way. Because here's what I've noticed, and this is so good, Tim. You're going to like this. When spiritual warfare becomes performative, it feeds our adrenaline more than our formation. Come on now. When it becomes individualistic, it turns faith into a private war instead of shared resistance against whatever dehumanizes us. Bro, I should just read him. You know what I'm saying? Like, why should I even talk? He's saying this so well. When it becomes obsessed with invisible enemies, it distracts us from the very visible forces of greed, racism, violence, exploitation, and division. Come on. And when it borrows the world's language of victory, dominance, and conquest, it starts to mirror the very powers it claims to resist.
What?
Come on. I'm going to keep going. It's so good. Jesus just did it. Jesus confronted evil, absolutely, but he did it without theatrics. He exposed hypocrisy. He touched the unclean. He forgave enemies. He refused to retaliate. He absorbed violence without returning it. He fought by telling the truth. He fought by loving enemies across boundaries. He fought by forming a community that could not be organized by fear or hierarchy. That looks very, very different from us shouting at the sky about Wi-Fi. Paul talks about the armor of God in Ephesians 6. And when we think about Roman soldiers, we picture them about, images like intensity and combat. But then we look at the armor that Paul gives and names: truth, righteousness, peace, faith, salvation, the word of God, prayer. These are not tools for domination. These are the habits of a community committed to love in a violent world. Come on. So I just want to throw out the idea that perhaps the church engaging in potlucks and coffees and breakfasts where 3 or 4 people get together and they just have honest conversations about their lives, and where people study the text in order to become better neighbors, and better humans. And we gather to remember the bread and the cup. Like, this is what spiritual warfare looks like. And the emphasis that we find in the New Testament on overcoming divisions and overcoming gender divides and ethnic divides and racial divides and economic divides, all of that falls under the banner of spiritual warfare too. And so when Paul, like, just read it, read the New Testament, doggone it, y'all, just read it and read it through this lens. And you will just see all Paul is doing is he's telling the church how to be human. And in their collective life together of forgiveness and compassion and submitting to one another and bearing with one another, in their collective life together, they're resisting the powers and principalities. Like, that's where we practice. And I just think, I never had that. I never had that understanding. I never had that understanding of why the church matters, why it's important, why it's not just the Sunday gathering, but it can be any time the community gathers, anywhere. If we are resisting the normal of human life together, then we're engaging in spiritual warfare. Thoughts, Timothy, because I see it on your brain.
No, I was just thinking I follow an account on Instagram called Nature is Metal. And it's just like animals hunting each other. But one of the common themes in like the natural world is how a predator will try to take an individual animal out of its pack to hunt it. Because when it's in its pack, they often won't get what they're looking for. So they try to isolate it, and then it becomes, and then you just look, it's like our theology was built to isolate. And when you think about it in regards to that, it's like, well, that's unfortunate.
Yes. And Tim, you're cooking with gas. That's a Midwest phrase that means like you're speaking truth, because that's exactly right. We have built, okay, not all, but some of my experience in my inherited tradition was exactly to facilitate my isolation from everybody else. And even the consideration of churches. Did the church meet my needs? Was I fed? Did I like it? Was it aligned with my values? You know, all of those very egocentric questions. All of that was just designed to feed my individual walk with Christ.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. One of the ways the powers have manifested themselves in America is this rugged individualism that, you know, it's only when you're addicted, it's only when you're at the bottom that, and you find, you know, if you're able to find like the life raft of genuine, real community, that you realize, this is what he's talking about.
Yeah, totally.
Right? Yeah. It's such a different feeling and such a different transformational series of events that begins to unlock when you find people that you are safe to be utterly yourself with. Yeah. And go. What were you going to say?
No, I have a question about flesh, but I don't want to take you off track. So I want you to finish what you're doing.
Really? Now you're worried about taking me off track, Tim. Yes. What is it? A question about what? Flesh.
Yeah.
Flesh.
I
thought you said flush. And I was like, okay. Let's go.
Some septic issues, but I thought maybe you could help. And then there might be others in the.
You need more fiber, Tim. I can guarantee you need to drink more water. And you need more fiber. I guarantee. I'm just looking at you going, yes. Let's talk about flesh for a second.
All right. So the three things you said: sin, death, and flesh. Now, how do you define flesh in that? Like, how would you define it? So I think that gets confusing for people because of how demonized we have been preached to about humanity. Mm-hmm. And so flesh obviously gets very easily translated into just being human or whatever.
Great pickup.
We were created as humans.
Yeah. And that's what the word means. Flesh is when Jesus took on flesh.
Mm-hmm.
It means he took on mortality, finitude, limitation, embodiedness, and that's not sinful. That's not sinful.
So why is that listed in on the bad list?
Well, because sin can inhabit our flesh, according to Paul. Now, we might use the language of addiction or compulsion. Paul uses the language of habitation, and I suspect he might be talking about the same thing, although I don't know that for sure. The idea that sin lives in my flesh. So, my flesh, you can think of my flesh or my body as a palette that I can fill with goodness or darkness, right? Now, Paul will say we are born enslaved, so that my flesh, without any external influence, always bends towards myself, and is used for selfish, exploitative purposes. But so flesh is neutral, but it can be inhabited or compelled by sin. So you take porn addiction or sexual addiction or murder, where our bodies all of a sudden get dominated by our own impulses or in conjunction with powers or whatever. And now our bodies are being used for wrath. Our bodies are being used to, it's like a car, right? The shell of a car is fine, but I can use that car in 1,000 different ways, depending on the manner in which I'm inhabiting the car. And so, Paul or Jesus will talk about the eyes of the body being lamps. And it's not what goes into your body that makes you unclean, but what comes out of your mouth as it represents. And he gives this, vice list. The idea is that our flesh can be a mechanism for blessing and shalom. Our flesh can be a mechanism for sin and wrath and domination. And there is some sort of synchronistic interplay between my flesh, so that the more I feed my flesh begins to dominate me, rather than me dominating my flesh, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think that's relatively straightforward. So when I hear him use just the word flesh, I hear body, I hear embodiment, I hear limitation. I don't hear anything sinful about that. But like when he'll talk about sinful flesh, I think he's talking about flesh that has been habituated into sinful habits and patterns. That can happen with your brain. That can happen with your tongue, right? James talks about the use of your tongue and speech. Mm-hmm. Paul talks about dedicating the members of your body to righteousness. So I think that's what we're getting at there. And part of the reason why, and we all know this, why the dopamine cycle is so hard to get out of, is it is habituating flesh, so that flesh now isn't a source of goodness and shalom in the world. It's now a source of like domination and self-desire and gratification. Does that help?
It does. I'm always trying to figure out why we ended up with a theology of just worthlessness about ourselves.
Because we are Gnostics, my friend. So from the very not earliest, but I would say second part of the first century, when you read the New Testament documents that were written a little later, like after 50, there is this boogeyman in the background that I think is like, Paul's addressing it in 1 Timothy and in Colossians. John is addressing it in 1st and 2nd John. That is incipient Gnosticism. And this is really important to understand. So I'm going to take just a second. There are two parts that we have to understand. So there is spirit, or fullness. And it's a word that's really important to the Gnostics. Is pleroma, I think is how you'd say it, a Greek word. And God is pleroma. And the idea is that God's pleroma, or God's fullness, is diffused throughout the universe in gradations. So that, and the key to getting to God's fullness is to transcend your mortal body through knowledge, which is gnosis in Greek. And that you go past these gates that you had to have the right answers to, and I'm dramatically oversimplifying it, so that you kind of transcend your mortal body.
After those gradients, is that?
As you go up higher through those gradients, you become more, I don't know what the word they would use, not in touch with, but I don't know. You become more, the pleroma becomes more accessible, maybe. I don't know how the right way to say that. But in the gradation of pleroma, God's essence or divinity, flesh has the least and spirit has the most. And so, in fact, spirit cannot, God's fullness cannot inhabit flesh, because flesh in its very nature is evil. And so this is all over the New Testament. So you have, like, we looked at Antichrist passages last week, where John's like, anyone that denies that Jesus came in the flesh is Antichrist. Well, he's going after people who would look at Jesus and say, well, if Jesus is God, there's no way he was in flesh, because God can't live in human flesh. And Gnostics would have one of two: when you realize your body doesn't matter and it's just your individual invisible inside that's the only thing that matters, right? So we're already seeing how this manifests thousands of years later, because going to heaven is just what happens to my soul. It doesn't matter what happens to my body. So you already see the effect of it. But let me just try to get through this chunk. So Paul will say things like, the fullness of deity lives in bodily form. All right, now fullness is pleroma. So what's he saying? It's totally against the Gnostics. The fullness of God lives in bodily form, and that bodily form is Jesus the Nazarene. Like, or even when he talks in 1 Timothy about there will be false teachers that command people to not marry and to abstain from certain foods, which God consecrated, and if we receive it with thanksgiving, those are fine for us to eat. When Gnosticism really got hold, it not only denied the bodily incarnation of Jesus and bodily resurrection, but it also denied any usefulness of the body in spiritual life. So people would either deny themselves ascetically in ways that weren't at all fully human, or they would indulge themselves in rampant immorality because it didn't matter what happened to their bodies. And so we still see this today. So salvation, in, again, my inherited tradition, was construed as my soul leaving my body. Rapture was souls leaving bodies and leaving earth altogether, and heaven was construed as a disembodied state. That's all Gnostic imagery. Discipleship was me at war with my body. The only thing I was ever told about my body is resist. Yes. Resist it. It was never talked about formation of my body or formation of my flesh or whatever it is. And so there is a lot of hangover that we have. And that is one of the reasons why flesh for us has become a purely negative thing. And so when Paul talks in, like, Romans 5 and 6, he talks about this trio of powers, sin, death, and flesh. He's also talking about presenting the members of our body as instruments of righteousness. And it's the idea that flesh itself isn't corrupted, but can be, and it can also be redeemed, right? You can redeem flesh. So the reason we have such a negative hangover about bodies is because there is still, like, we're still laced with Gnosticism. That's the reason why discipleship to Jesus in America is primarily an intellectual exercise of learning doctrine, rather than an embodied exercise of concrete, right, spirituality. That's why guys like John Mark Comer, who we know and love, Dallas Willard before him, have spoken powerfully into the church, saying, no, this is an embodied thing, like silence and solitude, Sabbath, resisting distractions. Like, that's why that there's so much need for that, because we're just not told what to do with our bodies, other than just either ignore them or not pay attention to them or just give in to them and just go like, well, it doesn't matter. And so much of Paul's teaching seems to be addressing that very early counterfeit, so that Paul is he keeps having to commend corporate concrete practices that sound so weird to us, but in the day they would have been like, oh, okay, like it's okay to get married, like 1 Corinthians 7. It's great to be single, and it's probably better, but you're not sinning by being married. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, and you should have sex with your spouse. You shouldn't deprive each other. Like, this was just sort of Gnosticism, I think, was in the background of so much of that, and we're still recovering from the hangover that Gnosticism kind of gave birth to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why some of the practices of the early spiritual fathers and mothers, like breath prayer, mm-hmm. or centering, like it always feels new agey whenever we do that mm-hmm. stuff. Yep. Because I was trained to see that as new agey. You know what I mean? Like, we do yoga.
It at our church, little house church, every time we meet, we do a Lectio breathing prayer.
Yes. Or and even
I have never felt as present in a quote unquote church environment that I do after a couple minutes of uncomfortably breathing and being in my body. And I mean that in a really good way. Like, it's so uncomfortable for me because it's so foreign.
Yeah.
That I love it. And it enables me then whatever we do after that, I feel like I'm there amongst those people to do that work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge blessing. And you can just see how that Gnostic idea, that was very helpful. Thank you. I hope that's helpful for people listening, because I think that's a hang up, because you hear sin, yes, bad, that enters in, and we have these things that distract us and dehumanize us, and death, not great. We don't, that's the end of our story. But so we want to, those things are not good things. And then flesh, oh, wait a second, that's me. And then, but we get in this, that Gnostic idea of this personal fighting or this personal thing is exactly what leads us to those little shame rooms, which then isolate. So it's a weird, like, you can see how much of a perpetuating cycle it was. And I don't know where the church ran with it. If it became like a power issue because it keeps people coming back for the fire insurance or whatever. It keeps us coming back if we feel like we have no agency in the conversation, and if we have no agency within a community, because this is a personal problem that I have that I need to deal with in the dark corners of my own home. So you can see just how just self-perpetuating that isolated shame cycle is. And if you build it as a theology, then it's an existential thing.
Okay. Can I go back to Gnosticism for 1 second?
Yes. I think that's really helpful.
Well, there are a couple of things I forgot. So Gnosticism existed, the ideas of it existed before it became Gnosticism. So they were floating around all over the place, even before the time of Jesus. But it got Christianized, and this is the part I forgot, where there are literally two gods in the Bible. There is the God of Genesis 1, who creates the physical world. And then there's the God of the kingdom. They called it the kingdom of light, which is the God of the immaterial realm. And so Gnosticism fed into this great dualism between material and immaterial, the God of creation versus the God of light, who is the God of the immaterial realm. And the reason death existed in their accounting was that death was necessary for us to separate our souls from our bodies. And then we would journey into the immaterial world, and we had to appease. There were different spheres that were often aligned with planets. This is the part that's coming to me now. And you had to appease kind of the demons that guarded each sphere. And you did that through, as you were ascending, you did that through aspects of knowledge. So it could be anywhere from like passwords or codes or phrases, formulas, whatever. And the collection of those was called the pleroma. So I think, we live very much, as you were just saying, in this idea that my immaterial soul has to go to heaven, but to get to heaven, I have to have the password. Mm-hmm. Right? And the password's Jesus. And like, you just see, when you explain it a little bit, you just see, oh, this is where some of this stuff originated from.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And why unlearning, so much of discipleship is unlearning as we explore the national park together. Yeah. There is no do or do not. The last thing, or no, there is no try. There's only do or do not.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
Is that what he says? It sounds like something he would say. All right. This has been a bit rambly, but
no, I think this is all very helpful and is on brand with what you're talking about.
You're on brand. The last thing it reframes is discipleship. And so just for me, Gambus and I had a very long conversation once. It was like 2 or 3 hours on just the subject of wrath. And, you know, wrath has always been, for me, the idea of God smiting people. And there was this Far Side cartoon, if you remember the Far Side, of an old man with a beard seeing this kind of doofus looking dude walking in the street. And he's walking under a piano that's being moved out of a window. And God is hovering his finger over the word smite. And in that instance, to hit the smite button would mean the piano falls, the dude, whatever. And that's literally the image that I had. Gambus represents and introduced me to a whole world of scholarship where wrath is, it's the very air, it's the particles of the air we breathe in a fallen world. Where wrath is, it's absolutely natural. Someone hurts me, I hurt back. Someone does something to me, I don't forgive. Somebody insults me, I insult back. Wrath it's all the hostility and the tribalism and the demonization and the ugliness. It's the fact when I see Hegseth do this stuff, I want him to be removed and disciplined in some way. I want him to be chastened. You know what I mean? It's like, and when you're participating in the new creation space of the kingdom, that's where God dwells and where his resurrection power is available for people when they're not using their privileges, but rather expending them for the sake of others. It's where, like, you experience God's power in those places that our world calls weakness. It's the confession, it's the admission, it's the lamenting, it's the reconciliation, it's all of that whole pattern of humility and service and, self-denial. That's where you meet God and encounter his power. When you step outside of that new creation space, you subject yourself to wrath, and not in a salvific way, but in a very real here and now way. And remember, part of God's wrath is being given over. So 3 times in Romans, God gives over, and that's an expression of his wrath. And so, like, you take pornography. Obviously there's the conceptual part, but the very practical part for me is also the realization that when I step out of new creation space, I begin to expose myself to the power lines of wrath that exist in our world. And one of the ways wrath manifests is being given over to something. You know what I mean? And all of a sudden it's like, oh man, discipleship becomes a lot different. It's not so much about keeping God happy with me, but even like with anger, Paul will say this really weird line, like, in your anger, do not sin. He's quoting from one of the Psalms. And then he talks about, being reconciled and don't let the sun go down in your anger, whatever. And the idea is, lest you give the enemy a foothold. Now, what's he mean by that? Now, I always thought that meant, okay, there's like a window in my soul and this unclean spirit comes in. And I don't know, maybe. I think rather what happens is when I step out of new creation space, I'm now exposed to wrath. And so, and if wrath manifests itself in being given over to something, then one of the ways that I'm opening myself is being given over. My flesh now becoming inhabited by sinful patterns. Or in my anger always, if I'm given over to anger, it always incurs wrath. Always. Yeah. From my kids, from like it becomes wrath, and wrath only invites more wrath. And so I'm literally stepping out of new creation space, and I'm now exposing myself, in Paul's words, to like giving the enemy a foothold. What's that mean? Is that like a window a spirit comes in? No, I think what it means is that this current age is doomed to destruction. It's just going to happen. And for those who stay in new creation space, it's very similar to Passover, right? The destroyer was coming over Egypt to destroy the firstborn, and Israel wasn't immune. They had to do something in order to become immune. And so they did Passover and marked their doorposts, and God literally protected them from the wrath that was at hand. And I think maybe that's the way it works, is that there is just wrath. Our universe is filled with wrath. And you can experience that now by cutting someone off in traffic who cut you off, and then it escalates, into more and more, until you're literally experiencing wrath. Or it could be that you're given over so that you're stepping more and more out of new creation space, and now your body is like inhabited by patterns of sinfulness.
It's being formed by it.
Exactly. And that if you hang out there for too long, whenever the self, what wrath does, and this was the point Gambas brought up that I never ever considered, God doesn't do anything to have wrath expend itself. Wrath is self-consuming. So wrath is what governs normal human life. Wrath upon wrath upon wrath upon wrath. And what Jesus absorbed was wrath, right? The animosity of the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders united against him. And so when I step out from new creation space, like I'm opening myself up. Now that doesn't mean I always, that's enough to stop me. It just means that like in the carnage of me stepping out from new creation space, I go, oh, this was wrath. Right? This was the enemy getting a foothold. This was, and so I just think I don't know if this makes any sense, but for me, it was a really powerful picture of why to avoid sin. And it's not because, God's not going to forgive me or I'm backslidden or whatever. It's far more, I want to limit my exposure to the wrath that is here and is coming, because what wrath does is it just self-consumes.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump's a great example of how wrath works, because everybody who gets brought into his orbit gets burned out, chewed up and spit out, ultimately becomes a traitor, no matter how faithful they've been. Like his orbit is wrath. That's all he is. He is literally the embodiment of the spirit of the age. And everyone that gets brought into that embodiment gets sucked down and chewed up so that they're just a shell of whatever they were prior to that. And I think, okay, that well of gravity that is the current president, that well of darkness that is the current president, to be caught in that orbit is in miniature what it looks like to be caught in the vast interconnected webs of wrath that are existing all around us. Does that make sense?
100%. And it's very, very dehumanizing. And then you watch that trickle down, if you want to use that example, to Ara and what's happening. You're just seeing how that out of that new creation space, how consuming that starts to become, and a domino effect that just perpetuates.
Well, look at what it's done to the
wrath.
Church.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
So now we have people on both sides who would love to see harm to him, who would love to exercise their wrath against his wrath.
Talked to Mazzy about it this morning.
You did?
Yeah, because she was reacting really big to some direction this morning, and so I was just trying to have a very calm conversation with her and give her tools to kind of navigate her anxiety and her anger. But then she's like, well, what? I was like, this is not, I want you to take a breath before you respond, take a breath before you speak, and blah, blah, blah. And this is not how we lead with kindness. Even when we disagree, we're going to lead with kindness. She's like, what if it's Trump? And I was like, then we would lead with kindness. Like, we're not here to match his demonization. We're not here to match his anger. We're not here to match his we're here to try to help other folks around us. So I was like, yeah, even in that case, you're going to dignify his humanity. And she's like, nope. Which I get, but you can see it because I get consumed by it. And what does it do to me? It tears me apart. And that's just being consumed by the ideological or listening to things. That's not even like
totally.
If I were to go further into that and participate in that, and then I would start tearing down other bodies. And so, yes, I think that makes 100% sense.
That's it. And so, to wrap all of this up, this minor, like several episode digression about the powers. Salvation, one of the ways salvation is construed in the New Testament is deliverance from one kingdom to another. And then embodying allegiance to that new kingdom when the old kingdom just comes naturally. And so the church exists as a monument to the resurrection, to the realness of the resurrection, but it also exists as a training ground for us to learn full humanity and to resist the cycles of wrath that are all around us. Oh. And so, it's as practical as like one of the things I do if I'm hurt is I go into the silent treatment. Now, the silent treatment can either be a good thing or a bad thing. Because on the one hand, the older I get, the less flippant in speech, especially when I'm angry, I've become. Mm-hmm. And the more I need time to sort of settle my thoughts, overcome my emotion, and then speak as to what's really happening. Mm-hmm. So sometimes silence is me saying, this is too much. I'm too angry. I will say something I don't mean. Mm-hmm. I want to win and I want to hurt. Mm-hmm. And so I need to withdraw. Other times, silence is, you're just not worth the effort. Mm-hmm. I don't even want to conflict with you. It's just not worth it. It's just not worth the effort. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to let you know that you're just not, like, it's a way to dehumanize.
Yeah.
And what does the silent treatment always provoke? It provokes wrath, right? Because it is dehumanizing. Mm-hmm. And I get torn up by it. Whatever relational dynamic is interrupted by it gets torn up by it. Mm-hmm. And so I just see this as literally the most practical way I look at my life is, am I standing in the new creation dynamics where God's power is readily available and his presence is felt? Or am I walking along the power lines of wrath that are existing in our world? And I can feel the difference, Tim. I can feel it. I can feel it when my ego is hurt and I need to like boast. I can feel it when I'm hurt and I want to withdraw to punish. I can feel it when I feel jealous and want to get bigger. Like I just can feel it in my body.
So what does that look like to you then to do that, to do exactly that, to not do into the silent thing or to come out offensive?
Yeah.
Like what is the new creation? And within that dynamic you were just talking about, what does that look like to you?
It's the dumbest thing, but it's just, it's what is helping so much right now in my life. And I literally, this is what I do. God, I invite you into this situation. That's all I pray. And Tim, I'm getting goosebumps. What, because this is a much longer conversation, but I want to be born again. I'm tired of being cynical. I'm tired of looking at people who are new to the faith and just shaking my head going, oh, if you only, whatever. It's like the old jaded married couple that sits at a new wedding and can't celebrate with the couple. And one of the things, so I went out to California and I'm hanging out with a lot of younger pastors, which is shocking because I'm young myself, who are just seeing this incredible spirituality happening among Gen Z folks. Mm-hmm. It's the revival. It's the worship. Mm-hmm. And I'm so cynical. I'm like, that's not revival. Don't call it that. It's only revival if it results in holiness and justice. Come on, man. And I think that's true. I really do. But I also feel the darkening of my soul going, that's just a dopamine high and there's nothing to it.
Yeah. That's hard.
And And I don't want to be like that. I want to be discerning, but I also want to be really hopeful. And I want to encounter the second naivete, the second innocence. And so I've been praying to God that he would help me be born again. And the parts of my Gen X cynicism would that aren't of him, that aren't discerning, would fade away and be healed or replaced. And so one of the things that I've been wanting to do is to recognize better the Spirit's work around me. And so as a result of that, in those moments when I'm angry, and I've done this, I had to do this last night. 2 nights ago. Super angry at somebody, not in my family, and wanted just to punish. And I when I had a moment of reflection, I just said, okay, God, I invite you into this situation. And it sounds so dumb and so cliche, but it's actually been really transformative for me in this period of my life, because instantly things will spring to mind that are things I don't always want to do, that will that get me out of my automatic, automatic responses.
Default response. Yeah.
Yes, it'll just sort of shake it up. And even if I choose to go with the default response, there's that pause that's just a second of recognition. And so I've just been praying that, like, with full innocence, like, God, I really invite you into this situation. And I don't know how to explain it. It's just been something that's been really, really helpful. And it's gotten me in some circumstances out of the default situation. And sometimes that just means, okay, I'm just not going to say anything for a while until I can say something really good and beautiful.
But not because, and it changes that because you're not brooding to, I know exactly what you're talking about with, like, inflicting this silent whatever to try to, I do it all the time, like all the time. And so I see that. And so when I think about what you just said, I don't think it's cheesy or simple or anything. It's like, it's literally how we've been talking about prayer. You're inviting, there's a spiritual element of this, but there's also a human physical element of you're saying, like, I'm going to take that second. I'm going to allow my default setting to pause and perhaps change. And so there is that marrying. It's not an incantation. You're not praying for expecting God's just going to change the whole thing, but you're also not just relying on your impulses or whatever to do it as well. It's that marriage again. And it just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, it's been something that's been really, really helpful, because I think even the pause to say, God,
like I told Mazzy this morning, like, take a breath before you respond.
The fact that God is already answering the prayer before I pray it, just simply by asking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, just by saying, God, I invite you into this. And, I don't know. It's been really, really interesting. My discipleship has changed so much over the course of my life. And not that it was bad, but I just think it wasn't the fullness. It wasn't fullness of being human. And I think it was way too individualized. And so I missed, when people say, man, I really want to experience God. Well, okay, that's really easy, actually. Go to the new creation spaces that look horrific and just stay there. Visit senior citizens. Take meals to people. Like, this isn't hard. This is where Jesus lives. If you're a person of high status, then work in obscurity someplace where you get no credit and you lift others up. Like it isn't rocket science, but it is. And so I don't know. I've said this before, Timothy, and that's why we're great together. I'm more hopeful than I've ever been, and I'm more angry than I've ever been. And I don't know how to carry those two together. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So I don't know what to do with that. Anyway, my friend, as always, you provoke us into much bigger and wider vistas. So I love you, and I'm grateful for you so very much. And you too, dear listeners, the tens of you that are still here, thank you. Man, what a joy to be a part of this. And we're very, very grateful. So, I don't know. Jesus takes the wheel.
Subscribe or die.
Perfect. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. The VOXOLOGY podcast is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is made possible by listeners just like you. If you'd like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/VOXOLOGY podcast or on Tithely, tithe.ly, and just search VOXOLOGY podcast. Links for both are in the show notes and on our website. You can interact with the hosts on Facebook /VOXOLOGY podcast or on Instagram at VOXOLOGY podcast and on Twitter or X, whatever it is, at Mike Erie. Thank you for walking this long road with us.